This training is on how to reduce your dependence on the modern food system by relocalizing your food supply. My name is Jason Matthias. My wife Shannon and I have 7 kids from the ages of 16 down to 6. You may have seen me before in any of a number of online or live presentations, including the Homegrown Food Summit, the Garden Hack Summit, the Mother Earth News Summit, as well as the Homesteaders of America Conference. I always enjoy presenting at these events and like teaching on these webinars as well to share what I've learned with all of y'all. So Seeds Generations is our family business that we started 7 or so years ago. It came out of a family heritage of gardening. I grew up in the garden in Southern California, and as I've gotten married and we've had kids, we've raised our kids in the garden as well. My background, if you didn't already know, was after college, I went into the Air Force and I was a pilot. I flew KC-10 air refueling tankers and spent a lot of time overseas, including my last active duty assignment. I was with the Army as a liaison officer and went to Afghanistan a couple times with them. But all of the travel, especially during wartime with lots of deployments, once we started having kids, it was really difficult to have the kind of family life that we wanted to have. So I decided to leave active duty and go to the reserves and pursue a more entrepreneurial career path. And after many twists and turns, which I won't go into right now, the good Lord has landed us at a beautiful homestead in the mountains of Virginia, known as the Maker's Forge, which we inherited from some friends of ours that we met and became good friends with over a decade ago when we first moved to Virginia. We continue to build upon the many amazing things that family did here. And as we are quickly approaching spring, the grass is not quite green here yet. It's just starting to get some green. But here in a few like this, and we'll have our kids out in the garden prepping the soil. We've actually done some of this already, and we'll be planting early potatoes soon. And before you know it, cucumbers will be coming in the garden. We get our kids involved in every step of the process, from planting potato bugs off of potatoes here to harvesting tomatoes in this picture. Some of my kids' favorites are green beans and tomatoes, but we get them involved in everything that we're planting or harvesting, including things like sweet potatoes, and in the fall, usually potatoes and onions and garlic. Of course, in the late summer, we get lots of tomatoes and a whole lot of other things, including pumpkins, squash, and almost too much to count, really. In addition to what we grow ourselves on our homestead, we actually grow apples on our homestead. We had an orchard here that the family before us planted, but we also buy in bulk locally and preserve a lot of that fruit, like apples and peaches, during the summer. We also raise our own meat. We raise meat chickens. We have rabbits. We have sheep, and we also raise pigs now. And if you've never had homemade bacon, you are missing out. In the fall, we harvest deer during deer season, and all the kids get involved in processing that, whether it's cutting it up for freezing or canning the meat, or making it a jerky. The kids get involved in raising the animals as well. Chickens here, you can see this is several years ago. We got a new batch of laying hens that the boys helped me fix up an old chicken tractor. We harvest rabbits throughout the year, and the kids actually do all of the harvesting and butchering themselves, as well as the processing and packaging. We also harvest fruit in season, not only from our own trees, but here at a neighbor's place, harvesting cherries, using the tractor bucket to help get the kids into position a little easier. So our kids are a little crazy, but it's a lot of fun. And when we're not for fresh eating, we're preserving them through canning at the end of the summer and in the fall. We are very blessed to live in a beautiful place such as this. But we've been on a long journey to get here. It's been well over a decade, probably really 15 years since my wife and I first started trying to eat healthier and source organic food beyond what we could grow ourselves, which at the time we had a small garden. We've been on this journey, which I like to call a return to the old paths, where we're trying to regain a lot of the lost skills of self-reliance and productivity as a family. If you didn't know, I part of this journey was about 5 or 6 years ago, getting involved with a documentary film project called Beyond Off Grid. And if you haven't already watched the film, you can learn more about that and the project at returntotheoldpaths.com. So let's jump into the meat of this presentation on how to reduce your dependency on the modern food system. Some of it is a return to the old paths, but a lot of it is just knowing what is going on and knowing what your options are. So here we are early in the year 2020, and if anything, 2020 was unexpected for most people. Prove that our food supply really is shaky and unstable in a lot of ways. There have been glimpses of the instability in the modern food system before 2020, but what happened about a year ago really brought a lot of things to the fore all at once. And so I want to review what has happened in the last year to help you understand where we're at, and it gives you a better understanding of the big picture and the context, particularly for why you need to be paying attention to this topic right now, because things are developing in a direction that is not good, and the things that have gotten us here, the causal factors, are not changing. They're actually worsening. And so therefore, that means that, we shouldn't wait any longer. We need to act now and be working diligently to protect our families from what is coming. So one of the first things we saw after the COVID-19 was kind of announced was this really unprecedented action by governments around the world, not just in the United States, but around the world, to essentially shut down everything. The lockdowns, social distancing, masks weren't a prominent part of it early on. Actually, we were told don't wear masks by Dr. Fauci and others. Of course, they changed their tune later, but nonetheless, this extreme shock to the American and the world economy had a big impact on food markets. And I want to talk about what some of those things were. So one of the first things that happened was a lot of processing plants, particularly meat processing plants, got shut down as workers there began to either get sick or, in most cases, just test positive while not having symptoms for COVID-19. Well, because the modern food system, and particularly in America, is highly centralized, not just in the production, but particularly in the processing, you have basically these extremely large meat processing facilities that tens or hundreds of thousands of animals per day. And because you have such a high volume going through a small number of very large facilities, basically what it does is it makes that facility with all these workers and all these meatpacking workers, that's kind of the ideal environment for a virus to spread. And so it spreads quickly. Are actually sick because of the fear over what COVID-19 might be. A lot of these facilities shut down. And so basically what happened is the kind of the final step in the production cycle for meat basically got shut down. Now, what happened there is not only did the meat going to the grocery stores get cut off or reduced overall, because not every plant shut down, but a lot of them did. You have to understand that the entire food production and distribution system is basically a just. Everything is moving at a rate based upon the consumption level of the goods coming out of that system. So when you're dealing with live animals, it's not like a factory where you're taking inanimate objects and you're putting it through a processing line to create something. If you have something that's inanimate, it's not alive, and it doesn't spoil, it can just sit there and then you can just resume production afterwards. But when you have an animal processing facility shut down, all the animals that are scheduled to go to that facility basically have nowhere to go. And so what ended up happening was you had thousands or hundreds of thousands of animals end up having nowhere to go, and because they didn't know how long these facilities were going to be closed, a lot of them were euthanized. So production output dropped dramatically. You had soaring prices, meat going to the grocery system. The other thing that happened, in addition to the the culling or depopulating of millions of birds, hundreds of thousands of hogs. Actually, at one point, in I believe it was April, there was over 100,000 hogs per day being culled or euthanized in America because they didn't have a processing facility to go to, and the farms didn't have a place to put them. They have the younger pigs have to move up into the new place, and the newly farrowing hogs, piglets, need to go into their place. So everything is moving, and you have these finished hogs ready to go to slaughter, and they don't have anywhere to go. So they were just basically burying them in huge. So the drastic drop in production led to shortages and to increased prices for meat. The other thing that happened, you saw this with eggs in particular. You had a shift from the prepared food industry. Restaurants, hotels, universities have large, food preparation businesses where people are eating prepared food. A lot of the production shifted from that because all those outlets got shut down. Restaurants got shut down. Hotel, food service type kitchens and stuff got shut down. So all of the fruits and vegetables and eggs and meat and stuff going to those locations, that all got shut down. And so you had these huge, you had stories about these huge piles of basically crops that had nowhere to go, or they were laying in the fields and they couldn't be harvested. So basically they just got plowed under, tilled under, because the supply chain was for certain farms was going all to that food service side of the food market as opposed to the grocery side. Now, over time that corrected and a lot more went to the grocery side, but the overall story is that there was also in dairy and some other things. In particular, one thing to note is that meat prices are still going up. And one of the notes I had from one of these stories was that in one distribution chain alone, meat sales jumped over 30% in the past month. And suppliers were only filling about 75% of meat orders. So like you had this huge drop in supply, huge increase in price because you also had an increase in demand for grocery store purchase of food as opposed to prepared food. One interesting thing is that this situation that we had, not just the initial shock, but the longer term impact of it was actually predicted. Thomas Massey, who is a Republican congressman from Kentucky, I firmly believe he's the best congressman in Congress. He's one of the few that actually opposes his oath to the Constitution, but he is a farmer, actually. So he is well aware of agricultural issues, and he serves on agricultural committee. But basically, he said our supply line is really brittle, and that he said this in April last year, that we could be weeks away from food shortages. And indeed, that actually ended up happening. He's continued to sound the alarm about this, about the ongoing problem with food, because the food market has not adjusted back. It's still having ongoing shortages, ongoing high prices. So what you find is you have these rising food costs and disruptions in the food supply. A couple of headlines here just showing that grocery costs have jumped the most in 46 years, primarily because of meat and eggs. And realize there's other things leading to egg production losses in particular, because there's some avian flu strains that are going around in certain countries that are affecting the production, because once they find those avian flu strains, they have to basically cull the birds that are tested for those. So this all ends up being a huge issue that ends up resulting in higher prices, and often ends up not just in shortages, in higher prices, but also in shortages. Also, you can see here on the right the spike in food prices. In April of 2020 alone, food prices were up 2.6%. And I realize that the prices that are normally reported for a year are in the low single digits. What is reported, not the actual, because the government discounts a lot of stuff to bring the number down so that it doesn't alarm people. But nonetheless, you see the spike in prices here in just a single month because of all those supply disruptions. So it's important to understand that this kind of thing could happen again, but there's also this longer term trend going on where a lot of it wasn't just the single shock to the system, but all the other constraints that are going on because of restrictions placed on farming and just on businesses in general because of COVID-19, particularly by governments and regulatory agencies. All these things are adding to higher costs of business. They can't have as many workers, or they have to have different kinds of shift work and different things to meet the health requirements. All these things are leading to higher costs. So costs are going to continue to rise. In addition to COVID and government overreaction for the most part to COVID and all of the negative effects those had on the economy, and particularly on the food economy, you had one of the single largest natural disasters, what was almost the largest natural disaster in human history that occurred last year, and that was the flooding in China. Record rains fell in China's Yangtze River basin. And if you didn't know, the largest dam in the world is at the Three Rivers Gorge Dam in China. The dam basically reached full capacity, and the Chinese, this was even after the Chinese, upstream of the dams, they were opening up outlets to let water out of the river so that it wouldn't break the dam. If this dam had failed, it would have killed millions of people and destroyed millions of acres of cropland. as it was reducing the flow of the river upstream, ended up reducing hundreds of thousands of acres, if not over 1 million acres of farmland in China. So China last year even was facing food shortages after these months of flooding and all the impacts on their farmland. Now, what this has done is China is basically facing a potential famine, and they're really struggling to figure out how they're going to be able to feed their people, which, it's the largest or second largest, most populous nation in the world, next to India. And they already imported a lot of their food before this happened, right? When they were producing their own food, they're struggling to produce their food for their own people before, and then after this happened, it made it even more of a crisis for them. What it has led to is China is trying to buy as much food as it can. It literally is buying record amounts of food, not just like crops, but particularly grain crops, feedstuffs, everything from corn to soy to wheat. And it is even, as you look at some of the industry news, that China is basically going to continue to buy, and even though we can try to increase production in the U.S., which is one of the biggest in soy and these crops that they need, we're not going to be able to keep up. In fact, it's so bad that China is actually pre-purchasing this year's crops that are just being planted or going to be planted in the near future. So some of the headlines here: China on course for highest purchases of U.S. wheat in more than 6 years. U.S. wheat and corn prices push higher after strong buying from China. So another interesting thing that is going on is that even though the U.S. is selling a lot of its grain and a lot of these feed crops, other nations are basically imposing very strict export requirements because they see this shortage coming, and they actually want to protect their people. The U.S. doesn't seem to be so concerned about that. I'll get to that a little bit later, but it's important to note that most of the buying that China is doing is from the U.S., because most of our food, and food product coming from these crops in the U.S. are grown in the U.S., it's going to impact as the increase in China. Commodity prices are the highest in about 8 years, 7, 8 years, according to the UN. And here's what I was referencing earlier: China's already buying up the current year's crop in advance before it's even planted, because they are trying to avoid famine in China. Now, as if all of these massive shocks that happened last year, whether it's COVID and the huge flooding and crop destruction in China, leading to massive increase in demand from China for particularly U.S. agricultural exports. On top of that, you have the new Biden administration is putting in place policies which actually are going to make the problem worse, not better. Whether it's the executive order regarding climate change that wants to reduce meat production. Basically, they want to get people off of meat because they say that meat increases greenhouse gases and all these other things. I'm not going to debate that here, but it's a bunch of poppycock. Or whether it's putting in place people like Tom Vilsack, again, as the head of the USDA, to implement a lot of these policies, putting in place regulatory freezes that basically are affecting U.S. farmers and going to have a negative impact on their ability to produce. All these things are leading to which is going to be leading to higher prices. And finally, to top it all off, if all that wasn't enough, now you had the huge Texas winter storm that happened last month, where there were many millions of dollars in crop losses, thousands of acres of crops lost. And there's a lot of crops grown in the winter in southern states like Texas and Florida that is going to lead to higher prices in fresh fruits and vegetables in the next quarter. And also, there's also impacts on livestock as well. So that's going to another negative impact on the meat market. Overall, globally, probably more so than in the U.S., but globally, there's going to be massive increases in food overall, particularly in meat, and the U.S. will not be insulated from this. So with those kind of current events context in place, I want to talk real quick, take even one more little step back to look at the background of how we got here, because it's important to understand why things are the way they are, and that is a contrast to some of the solutions I'm going to offer later on. Okay, so we need to talk about how do we get to this point? What happened to lead us to this place where we have these massive, huge shocks to the food system? It's not just that there's these, once in a lifetime event or once in decades events. Part of it has to do with the way that the system has developed and its lack of resilience in adapting to those kind of shocks. Okay. So the first thing we understand is that there's been an agricultural transformation from earlier in America's history to today. You had America really was an agrarian nation for most of its history up until the mid 1800s. And even much of the United States, in terms of geography, was agricultural until much later than that. So, whereas you had, massive production that was distributed across millions of small farms in earlier years, what we have today, and particularly since World War II, and farming became much more industrialized, and in particular became very chemical based and mechanized through the use of tractors and such, is that there are fewer and fewer farmers, in part because the cost of doing business with this new industrial chemical farming system are too high for most farmers to be able to make a profit. So you have this huge loss of family farms. Family farms decreased from 7 million family farms in 1900 to about 2 million just a century later, at the end of the 1990s. This centralization of agriculture has led to more and more processed food being consumed, in part because instead of growing lots of food closer to where people consume it, and a wider variety of food and fresh foods and vegetables, we have a lot more acreage in corn and soy that goes into processed food that you see in the grocery store every time you go into the processed food aisles, right? So one of the things that led to that is that government has subsidized agriculture to grow certain crops, corn and soy in particular. And the reason that they did this primarily was to provide cheap inputs for food producers to produce these processed food products. And that's led us to where we are today, where the vast majority of food is not local, is not even regional. It's actually very distant from the point of the customer and of consumption. This is true not only in terms of processed food products, but also fresh food products. If you look at where fresh fruits and vegetables come from, The vast majority of them come from California, which is known as America's fruit basket. If you've not seen these numbers before, they are pretty amazing. Over 90% of almonds, grapes, walnuts, apricots, plums, celery, garlic, processed tomatoes, broccoli, all are grown in California, and in the 80% for strawberries and lettuce, most avocados, peaches, spinach, carrots, and on and on and on. There's just a massive amount of fresh fruits and vegetables grown in California and the Central Valley. Now, this is only possible because of irrigation. California is a naturally arid climate. It just so happens that the Central Valley is very productive for growing crops because of the climate, but it requires irrigation from reservoirs that take water coming from rivers, in particular the Colorado River and some others. Of course, what that does is when you have so much of the agricultural production centered in one small area, what happens when there's not enough rain? Well, we actually had this happen about 5 or 6 years ago. There was a massive drought, multi-year drought in California, and this is what the reservoirs look like. They dried up. And so the California Water Board had to start cutting off irrigation water supplies to lots of counties. And it ended up having a huge effect on fresh fruits and vegetables production, in particularly certain fruit trees. You know, when a orchard farmer has to cut off irrigation water to an orchard of fruit trees, it's not like, you know, oh, well, we'll just grow them again next year. I mean, if those trees die, now they have to plant new ones, and then takes 5 to 10 years to get back to the same level of production. So this high centralization in food production, not just in terms of processed food products, not just in terms of meat production, but also in terms of fresh fruits and vegetables, primarily in California, all lead to high level of systemic risk for events, flooding, other impacts like we've seen in the past year, which are less common, but nonetheless, when they hit and they hit together, it has a huge impact. And this year, we're going to have the most dramatic impact on our food system because of all the stuff that's happened in the past year. Now, that's the production system. Let's talk about the distribution system. It's important to understand that the modern food distribution system is a petroleum based, meaning it needs fuel to get fresh fruits and vegetables from California over to central or eastern US, and it's just in time supply chain. That means that there's only a 3-day supply of food on hand at normal consumption rates in the grocery store. It used to be there was a stock room in the back and they would have extra supply back there, but right now, as of the past decade or so, that is not common anymore. In fact, it probably doesn't exist at all, just because it's inefficient from a profit and loss perspective. In particular, the most efficient way to run a grocery store is to have stuff there just in time for people to buy it. And the resupply is ordered based upon what is being sold and going out the door. So the registers that are ringing people up, all of the data that gets collected by those when people buy stuff, all automatically goes into a reordering system that is then shipping the replacement products to replace what was bought into that store in the next couple of days. So there's this constant flow of stuff coming in and constant flow of stuff coming. So if there's some kind of shock to a system, like a storm coming or COVID or whatever the thing is, it makes the distribution system very vulnerable to shocks in either supply or demand. And what you saw in it was actually shocks on both sides of the equation. You had increased demand from people who normally eat out but now have to buy food at home, and then you had a reduction in supply, in some cases massive reduction in supply for certain products like meat, because those processing facilities were closed. And these normally system shocks happen on one side or the other, but in 2020, we actually saw them on both sides of the equation. And unfortunately, even though they could have lived supply disruptions or demand disruptions, they've had much longer lasting effects than that. So with that in mind, let's talk about why should we relocalize our food supply? Particularly, why should you relocalize your food supply? Well, there's a number of reasons beyond some of the ones that are kind of obvious from what I already discussed. The first one is that provides lower nutrition. It's just the fact that when chemical agriculture, in particular, treats growing things much more like inanimate objects in a factory than they do the actual animate objects that they are. And often it oversimplifies things to an equation that does not result in the highest quality food products, and particularly does not yield very high nutrition levels for the crops being grown. In addition to the lower nutrition value for crops being grown in that system, there's also a loss of nutrient value during transport. So if you were to pick some squash from your garden that you grew and eat them, the nutrient value in those squash are going to be much higher than what you can get in the grocery store because you just picked it. And from the moment you pick something until the moment you eat it, there's a continual loss of nutrient value over time. And so the longer that it takes to transport, the longer that it is sitting on in the produce section or whatever, the lower the nutrient value is. Never mind the fact that in most cases, quote unquote, fresh fruits and vegetables are not actually picked when they're fully ripe, because if they were, then they would go bad by the time they get to the point of sale. So most fresh fruits and vegetables you buy in the store, unless they're local, are not going to have the maximum nutrition value that they even had their potential to have, because they have to pick them early so that they can withstand transport. And then often ripening is forced right before being put on the shelves, or even at the store. A lot of fresh fruits and vegetables are force ripened using ethylene gas. There's none of that. Also, vegetables are not as nutrient dense when they're picked early across the country as they're picked locally and sold to a market or from a neighbor or something like that. In addition to the nutrient deficiencies of the modern food system provides for these kind of food products, there's also food safety issues. The same kind of mass centralization that we have in the meat industry also often exists in the produce industry. Because there's so much production in California in particular, you'll have, these huge farms, but there's a lot of huge farms, and they will all ship to, if it's not field packed, a lot of leafy greens do with product not just from the same farm, but from many other farms. So if one farm provides contaminated product, let's say, for instance, that it somehow got E. coli on it, probably because it was using some kind of, not clean waste product being used as fertilizer, that, one batch of contaminated spinach or kale or whatever it is now goes through the same processing equipment and spreads contamination to all the other products going through the same processing line, even though they're coming from other farms that aren't contaminated. So the centralization of processing leads to food safety issues. It's actually a recipe for pathogenicity, for spreading pathogens from one batch to another batch on a massive scale, which is why there's often recalls, massive recalls of certain food products. It's because of these centralized processing facilities. It's also important to realize that food on average travels 1,500 miles or more to go from the farm to the point of consumption. Now, a lot of this is an average, and it has to do with the fact that the east part, the east, and most of the produce is grown in California. So that adds to that whole equation that comes up with this number. But the reality is that most of the food you're going to get in the grocery store, unless it's actually local and identified as such, which you tend to see more these days in local produce, long distance to get to you, which means that it's losing nutrient value. It wasn't as ripe when it was picked, so it's just not as good for you as stuff that is grown locally to you. And also, as we can see, has been demonstrated by the past year, there's these huge market forces that drive prices and the supply chain. And there's probably no better example of how of a large market force than the nation of China, having a really, really poor agricultural production year last year and facing famine in their country, and now trying to buy up food from all over the country, all over the world. But many nations putting in place export bans where they won't sell food. So the U.S. is the primary place to import food from. So let's talk a little bit more about why we should relocalize our food supply. One reason that it's important to buy local if you can is that it allows you to have quality assurance through relationships, not just labels. The USDA organic label is great if you don't have anything else, if you don't have another option, but it's important to realize that that label does not necessarily mean that the you're buying is as healthy as it could be, or in particular that it's even lacks contaminants. The reality is that the big agricultural producers, the big farms, they essentially co-opted the organic and the organic standards. So there's lots of things that are considered organic and meet the USDA organic standards, but that are not actually very healthy for you. I won't go into more detail than that, but the reality is that it's much more beneficial if you can know your farmer and who's actually producing your food and have a relationship of trust with them, even if they don't have organic certification. If they're growing according to organic standards, they raise the food, you know personally from a relationship with them what the food quality is. And in particular, because it's local, they're going to be able to pick it when it's near peak ripeness, which means you're going to have greater nutritional value from that food. Buying local also helps you regrow your local economy. The reality is that agriculture is foundational to a local economy, to most local economies, especially in rural areas. It allows you to reconnect to your community through food, which is a really great thing. It helps keep food dollars local, which helps build small business, not just farms, but also small food producers. And it can help create jobs on the farm, which frankly are one of the best things that we could have these days because of how unhealthy many jobs have become, because they lead to sedentary lifestyles, lack of sunlight, lack of exercise, all those kind of things. Also, if you didn't realize it, the average American spends about $7,500 a year on food. That's just the average American. If you take that number and extrapolate it and do some math, if you have a city of 40,000 people, if you just have 10% of those people spend just 10% of their food budget on local food, that's $3 million of expenditures that can go to local food producers and stay in that local economy, which means that those local farmers in many cases are going to spend that money on other local small businesses as well. So if you increase these percentages, obviously the numbers go up pretty quickly. So it's important to realize that uh, agriculture has a huge impact because everybody has to eat, and over the course of a year, it's one of the largest expenditures that we make is food. Talk about relocalizing your food. It's important to understand there are degrees of local. There's regionally produced food. There's local. There's food storage that you actually have in your home, and then there's what you grow yourself. There's different definitions for local, but I would say that even if you can't get something local, if you can get regionally, like within 100 or 200 mile radius, that is going to be better than something from all the way across the country. Again, because of the issue of being able to pick food, particularly fresh fruits and vegetables, when they're near peak ripeness, which means that they have maximum nutrient value, in addition to better flavor and everything else. Okay, so some of the steps of determining what is local and what isn't local, and how do you try to source locally? How do you try to relocalize your food supply? The first thing you want to know what you can't buy locally. Now, this is fairly obvious once you start breaking down some items where some of these products are produced. You're not going to be able to find them locally, at least not very easily. So unless you live in an area, a region that has lots of farms that grow grains or beans, these are not local for most people. They tend to be done on larger farms in certain areas, like there's a lot of wheat grown in the northern plains. Beans are grown in other areas, but these are not necessarily grown by small local farms that you'd be buying from, because they are grown on a large scale. They're harvested usually mechanically and processed. So there's more involved. It's not like picking a green bean. You have to wait till the bean is completely ripe, and then it gets harvested, and they get stripped from the shells, and all the chaff gets cleaned out, all that kind of stuff, and then they get dried, and then as in dry form, beans can last for quite a number of years, and wheat can last for 20-25 years if it's packaged properly. So these are good long-term food storage items. Foreign products, in particularly things that don't grow in the United States. While there is some olive production, there's very little of it. It's only in a few places like California, Texas. There's almost no coconut production in the United States. So coconut oil is always produced overseas from different climates, like which obviously can come from places like Texas, except for when the great winter storm of 2021 hits and destroys the crops. So citrus is going to be more expensive here in the next few months at least. So let's talk about what things you can buy or should be looking to buy locally. Where to buy? First, buy from local farmers and food artisans. Everything from fresh produce to meat. Talk a little bit more about meat, but you can also buy from cottage food creators, whether they're making processed food or things like jerky and other stuff like that. You can often get great things from local producers. Network in your community. You may not be able to grow everything you need on your property, but maybe your neighbors have excess that they can share with you, or that you can buy from them. Also, frequent restaurants that source locally. Obviously, it's important now to support local restaurants because they're hard hit by COVID. But in particular, if you can support ones that source local food, then you're also supporting the local farmers as well. All right, so let's talk about some local buying options. On the purchasing and distribution side, buy them. Farmers markets are a great place to start, in particular for finding farms that are local to you, and that you can talk to the farmers and find out how they raise their crops and so on and so forth. After you do that, you might actually look at going to the farm and buying from a farm stand, or buying direct, in particular larger quantities. If you want to do any food preservation, that's a great way to do it. Meet them at the farmer's market, but then follow up with them at the farm. There's also community supported agriculture, or CSAs. This is where you basically buy a share of the produce from a certain producer for a season, and then you get usually a weekly box of fresh fruits and vegetables from that farmer. There's also buying clubs or cooperatives, which is a way for you to often purchase from local farmers through these. The buying club is kind of an aggregator, but also often you can buy non-local items, product distributors that you can buy in bulk quantities. And by pooling your purchasing power through a buying club, you can buy things at better costs. And often you can find stuff that you can't find easily at local stores, like local grocery stores, especially if you're trying to buy organic or natural products. Some product types you should be looking for: meat, beef, chicken, and pork are the three main ones, but also you can get things like lamb or goat meat if that's something that you want. There's also dairy, raw milk, obviously, but also cheese. Sometimes local dairy producers also make cheese. Fresh produce, obviously, vegetables primarily, but also fruit. Often you can go to local orchards, whether they're pick your own or not. Pick your own berries are really popular. We do pick your own berries for blueberries, strawberries, sometimes bramble fruit like raspberries and such. But local orchards obviously often will allow you to pick your own, but sometimes they will, when they're grading the fruit, they will set aside stuff that is slightly blemished or is not the right shape or whatever. And those are often referred to as seconds. If they're apples, sometimes they're referred to as deer apples, but often you can buy these in larger quantities, like by the bushel, for very affordable rates. And that is great if you want to process food for canning, like making applesauce or canned apples or stuff like that. We do that as well, even though we have a small orchard here. We often use more fruit than what we are able to produce, and so we buy in bulk that way. Also, homemade food products, but also things like jams and even baked goods. Often you can find local producers selling those. Often you'll find at local farmer markets, sometimes you'll find people selling baked goods as well. So the pros of a farmer's market. First is the selection. Obviously, you're going to have multiple vendors there, so you have a wider selection if you're looking for specific things. Easy access because they're all in one place. You can talk to multiple vendors, and this is probably the biggest positive that I see about farmers markets, because you can find out what their values are, what their production methods are, those kind of things. The downsides of farmers markets, it's not necessarily local. Sometimes you'll find vendors at farmers markets who are coming from quite a ways away, or who source from other producers from a long way away. So it's not necessarily local. You have to ask. Sometimes there's aggregators there that will buy from multiple farms and then bring them to the farmers market. The other thing is that they're not always organic. You have to ask what the production standards are. However, you can sometimes find farms who are not certified organic, but essentially who use organic standards. They're just not certified organic because of the extra cost that it puts on their operation, that they don't want to have to pass on to the customer because it makes them less competitive price-wise. Buying direct from the farm is a great way. Sometimes you'll find these little roadside stands near intersections or along roads that you can buy from. The freshness is probably unparalleled for these options. They're usually putting them out there the day that, or they might be 2 days old or something like that. Allows you to know your farmer. You actually go to the farm and talk to the farmer often and get to know them. Efficiency is probably the biggest. There's no middlemen. They're just selling direct, right? So they get all of the, they get every single bit of your food dollar. And often you can get bulk discounts going direct to the farm, which is one of the best things you can do. Some of the downsides, selection is sometimes limited, not as good as the farmer's market, and requires travel to actually get to the farm, which if you're not near it can be a downside. Now, if you want to do a CSA, this is a great option. The pros are you're actually partnering with a farmer to share in both the risk of the farm and the reward. If you know they have a crop that doesn't do well, then you're not going to get as much or any of that particular type of crop. But also, if they have a bumper crop of something, you're going to get more of it. The biggest thing is that you're partnering with the farmer, and so it enables them to basically plan the production appropriately for the number of customers that they're planning for. So there's less waste with that type of a setup because things are planned out better. It's not as much of a guessing game. Also, the big pro is that often there's delivery to a local location, sometimes home delivery. So it makes it a lot easier for you, especially if you're busy and don't have time to drive out to a farm or even go to a farmer's market. Downsides, choice of produce can be somewhat limited, and if you have a poor harvest, it's going to affect the overall value that you get out of a CSA share. If you're doing a buying club or a co-op, it doesn't have to be formal or fancy like this picture shows, where there's actually like a storefront type setup. But the big pro is that it's pooling your purchasing power to give you more options and better pricing. And the downsides are there's an administrative or time cost. Sometimes to be a part of a buying club, you actually have to contribute some of your time to help process in bulk quantities and break them into smaller quantities for the members. All right, meat products. If you're buying cuts of meat, a USDA inspected processor process that meat. The farmer cannot, by law, process on farm, and so sometimes it's sold by the farmer, sometimes sold in retail locations if it is a USDA inspected processor for cuts. The other way is to buy animals or a portion of an animal, such as buying half of a cow or half of a hog. You pay the farmer for the animal, and then you pay the butcher to process. The farmer usually delivers the animal to the butcher. So you're basically paying the farmer for raising the animal for you and taking it to the butcher, and then you're paying the butcher his processing costs. And then you get to tell him how you want your cuts of meat, how you want the animal broken down into the cuts of meat. Be aware that if you're buying animals in particular, or parts of animals, you're going to need a lot of freezer space to transition to buying meat in bulk, because you're typically going to be buying like 6 months or even 12 months of meat at a time of that particular thing. So you're buying like a half a cow or a whole hog or something. Just for reference, our family, which there's 9 of us, we have three upright freezers, full upright freezers, 1 chest freezer, and we have 3 refrigerators, which also have like a small freezer. So we have a lot of freezer space. But then again, we go through at least 2 pigs a year, probably 60 chickens, 30 rabbits, deer, and obviously there's also other things like berries and things we buy in season and freeze. Most of the freezer space is taken up by meat. So that's an important thing to notice. You have to have the infrastructure to support it, and also count the cost of electricity to keep the stuff frozen. All right, some local food resources to keep in mind. To find farmers and producers near you, you can use localharvest.org. That's a good website that has a lot of basically farmers set up profiles there and put information about their operation and how you can buy from them. Eatlocalgrown.com is another one, and eatwild.com is another one. If you want to learn more about the local food movement and the kind of back to natural organic food movement, there's some good films that you can also the dangers of the modern food movement. Food Inc. is a popular one that's been around for a long time. Fresh is one of my favorites, and Farmageddon is a film about how the government regulatory small farmers, unfortunately, to get rid of the competition for the big guys. Another good one is Food Matters, which talks about like the importance of healthy food and local food. A couple of books to recommend: The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan and Joel Salatin's book, Folks, This Ain't Normal, are both great books that give you a better idea about why we should be looking for healthier food produced locally if at all possible. All right, well, let's talk real quick about food storage. I'm not going to go into detail, give you some highlights. This regional, local food storage, next level down from locally or regionally produced food. So why do we want to do food storage? Well, remember early in the presentation, I talked about how there's only a 3-day supply in the grocery store at any given time under normal consumption rates. Well, unfortunately, most Americans have the same problem in their own homes, in their own pantries. So they don't have a lot of food stored up. So if there is some massive supply disruption, COVID, or maybe a winter storm that knocks out the power for a week, like in Texas, they may not have enough food to get through that time period, at least not to get through it with comfort, right? So food storage is important, not just for survival, but also to thrive amidst disasters and unexpected things happening. And if you want to eat healthy in particular, it's important that you plan ahead and then you have food stored. And this includes things like buying fresh food in season, like buying peaches or apples when they're in season and processing them through canning. So you have them available throughout the winter and spring when they're not available. Because if you can budget, price is lower and you're going to be getting more nutrient dense food at a better price. Another reason, which again was exemplified this past year, was the fact that food storage helps insulate you from the impacts of job loss or personal financial calamity. There's lots of people lost their jobs because of COVID lockdowns. You can imagine the stress that would be taken off if you had food stored so that you didn't have to have money to go buy food for a while. Obviously, it's a huge stress reliever. So that's another good reason to have food storage. And of course, what we're experiencing now, inflation and the loss of buying power. Realize there's food inflation, not just because of the factors going on in the food market, but also because the government is deficit spending to the tunes of trillions of dollars. Last year actually spent, well, I think in the past year has spent over $6 trillion of additional spending. And there's no way you can tell me that that's not going to create additional inflation, especially because a lot of the money is going in direct payments. So, more money in circulation means that they're buying more and the prices of everything is going to go up. So inflation is going to be across the board, not just with food, but in particular with food. And realize that if you buy food now and store it, you're buying it at a lower cost than what it will be in 6 months from now when the currency is depreciated more and things are more expensive. Food storage also helps insulate you from weather, whether it's flooding or food storage. So you go to your pantry to get what you need. You store what you eat and eat what you store, and make sure you store it correctly so you eliminate waste and you don't have as much food waste by, obviously, if you store it incorrectly, then it goes bad. It doesn't do you much good. So make sure you store it correctly. Preserving what you grow is one way that you can build up food storage. Another way is bulk purchasing in season. This gets you maximum nutrient value, the lowest cost typically. And if you preserve it yourself, then you're able to know how it was preserved and put it into your food storage as such. Another great reason is that you can be social and work together, whether it's in the garden or whether it's processing food. All these things are social activities that can help build relationships. Real quick, I'm going to end here with a bit about food preservation. Some of the methods of food preservation that you should be considering. Dehydrating is probably one of the easiest to do. It doesn't require special equipment, though most people will buy food dehydrators to process food in this way. The nice thing about dehydrating food is that it's going to provide you with it's going to reduce the size and the weight in particular, because a lot of the weight in food is water. And by taking the water out, you're going to be able to reduce it so it can be more compact and also less dense, less weight. The other thing is that it preserves most of the nutrient value as well. Anytime you heat something, such through canning, it can reduce the nutrient value. So drying is a way to preserve most of the nutrient value. Freezing is probably the easiest, and it's the one that is going to leave your food closest to its natural form. We do this primarily with things like berries because we like to have them, if you freeze berries, you can then later make pies with them. You can thaw them and make a berry compote. You can use them in all kinds of dishes like they were fresh. Canning is probably the primary way that we preserve our garden produce. Everything from pickles to canned beans to beets. This is a mixed vegetable relish that my wife makes. All these different ways of preserving garden produce so that we can enjoy it later without refrigeration or storage, often referred to as root crops, everything from potatoes to carrots, beets, and other types of root crops. And also kind of in this category, though not technically root crops, would be winter squash, because when they're cured properly, they will last many months in the proper storage conditions. And so you don't need to have refrigeration. You don't have to process them. You just need to keep them in a cool place, like a root cellar or a basement. Fermentation is another way. It's kind of an older method that has come into popularity again. Fermentation is typically done with a salt brine. It kind of like pre-digests the food a little bit, it softens it a little bit, so it works really well for crunchy vegetables. The best pickles are made with fermenting. Basically, what you see here is mixed vegetables, but this is essentially like a ferment with these. Is kind of that's a great way to make food very nutritious and be. It's fairly easy to make. The one thing that's the downside about it is after it ferments at room temperature for 3 to 5 days, you have to put it in the refrigerator to slow down the fermentation process so it doesn't turn the food to mush. And so it does take refrigerator space. So typically you do these in smaller batches over time, but you can do them throughout the year whenever you have fresh vegetables coming in. The last, which is not necessarily one you do at home, but is probably the best food preservation method, is freeze-dried food. Freezes the food and then vacuums out the water. It basically is what will make the food the closest to what it's like in its natural form. It preserves all of the nutrients like freezing does, but it doesn't require refrigeration. So basically, the food is freeze-dried and then typically put in a sealed container. We buy our freeze-dried food from Thrive Life, which is one of the highest quality manufacturers of freeze-dried food. And their food in the cans, unopened, can last up to 25 years. Once you open it, it has a shelf life of, depending on the product, from a few months to up to a year. If it's kept closed after, with like a plastic lid, after the metal lid is removed. So that's another option too, and is really good for certain types of things that are hard to get, hard to preserve in other forms. So real quick before we get to Q&A, here's what local food could look like. Some local stories that talk about this topic. So you could have a local community egg sale. Is it one example? You can do different things for like Mother's Day and other holidays. I mean, frankly, our family business has had this experience over the past year, where as more and more people are growing, is gone skyrocketed, and we're in a much better place now. But a year ago, we were having trouble keeping up with the demand, and a lot of other seed companies have had the same experience. Also, because of and the lack of availability last year, a lot of people were looking to local producers, and so a lot of the local meat processors ended up having a huge surge in demand. And basically, I know some meat processors that it's months before you can get an opening into their facility to get an animal processed. So if you are going to be buying from local producers, buying meat from local producers or animals, make sure you secure your animal as early as possible, because a lot of them have waiting lists that will go months into the future. So you need to make sure you act early on that. And there's other stories showing small farm businesses are really thriving despite the pandemic, in part because people are, I think more than anything, they're really kind of shook out of their normal habit pattern. They're at home, they want to get out, and they want to, they're cooking more, they want to buy local ingredients. So those all contribute to local farms doing well. Here's another story talking about the resurgence in local agriculture. So all these things are good, positive signs. And I think, if you haven't already jumped on this bandwagon, so to speak, it's a good time to relocalize your food supply. So we're going to take questions here in just a minute for a little while, but I want to let you know that we're also having, in addition to this training, we're doing a relocalize your food supply for the next few days, and you can get discounts on select seeds that we're putting on sale, as well as some of our books that help you with garden planning or other topics, as well as our gardening aprons, which make a lot of work in the garden much more enjoyable and productive. So with that, we'll go to questions. Go ahead and click the Q&A tab on the side of the page and ask your question if you haven't already done so. I'm not going to, because of the technical issues and this presentation going long, I'm not going to take a whole lot. Go ahead and throw them in there now. We can take the ones that we have for a little while here before we wrap up. Here's a good question about food inflation. What kinds of food should we focus on to get ahead of food inflation? As I mentioned earlier, China in particular is buying massive amounts of feed crops, in particular, soy, corn, certain types of seed oil as well have been affected. So also wheat, dry beans, even rice, those kind of things that will store for a long time. Because they store for a long time in particular, those are good to buy now, in particular because you're going to be able to store them for a long time. You're basically buying at a lower price now than what they will be later. And also because with all the crazy stuff going on, I mean, it's better to get them now than later. They also tend to be high caloric value in grains and in beans, and they're easy to store. So those are the things I would focus on. Ultimately, I would say, what does your family eat? Stock up on what you guys eat the most of. If you, like tomato products, eat a lot of Italian or something like that, buy cases of canned tomatoes or spaghetti sauce or whatever, those kind of things. Buy those now because they're just going to be more expensive, 3 or 6 months from now. Here's a good question. What's the easiest way to begin producing your own meat? This question kind of depends on your circumstance. In other words, it depends on the nature of like your property and what you can do. So in general, these types of meat to raise are going to be chickens or rabbits. Rabbits are actually the easiest all around, primarily because you can raise them in a backyard, even in places where you might have restrictions that would keep you from getting like chicken. Also, the other thing that are better about rabbits than chickens is that chickens have feathers, which are difficult to get out when you're processing them, whereas rabbits have hide and that comes off easily when you're processing. So if you're going to be processing animals like one at a time or in small quantities, rabbits are definitely better for that kind of scenario. If you have more land and you want to raise a larger quantity of meat, typically chickens are going to be the best way to go. However, the processing piece of it, because of the feather issue, is going to require either just some stick-to-itiveness to pluck them by hand, or you have to buy or find somebody who has the equipment, a scalder and a plucker, to help automate that process to make it go quicker. We partner with a friend of ours we've butchered with for years who has pretty good size scalder and plucker. And so we just schedule our chicken processing with them, and we all work together to get it done. So in terms of bang for the buck, chicken is going to be the quickest. The one benefit about rabbits is that they will eat grass and greens forage. So you can cut down your feed bill if you have grass that you can give them. So here's a gardening question. What are some ways to increase your garden production when you don't have much space? I've done entire presentations just on this topic, but in short, if you're limited on space, the best thing is to grow up. So vertical gardening methods like trellising and interplanting, where you put multiple crops in very close proximity to each other. Those are both ways that you can get more production out of what you have. You don't necessarily have to have an in-ground garden to grow. You might be able to add a raised bed somewhere. You might be able to turn a flower bed into a garden bed and do some edible landscape. Meant to be able to use containers on your patio and grow peppers and tomatoes in those. There's lots of ways that you can increase growing space. So I would say you can definitely make an existing space more productive through vertical gardening and interplanting and intensive spacing, those type of things. But also you can increase your garden space by using containers and other more creative methods of increasing the space you have to grow in. Here's a good question. What's the best way to build up food storage when you don't have a lot of extra money in your budget? So this is kind of one of the most challenging things about food. One thing I'll note, one of the best times of year to work on food storage is in the spring when you're getting your tax refund, because typically that's money you don't budget for. One of the best things you can do with that extra money is to put it towards food storage, because again, you're buying food now at a lower cost than it will be available later. And you also help to increase your resilience and reduce your risk of future shocks to the system. So I would recommend that you look at using some of those for building up food storage. Outside of that, what I would say is you really need to pinch pennies and be as frugal as you can, and look for ways that you can start making bulk purchases that are going to give you better unit costs on things. So look at the things that you use the most of and try to buy those in larger quantities, bulk quantities that give you a lower unit cost. Because essentially what you're doing is you're reducing your cost per unit, buying more of it at once, and then you're not going to need to buy that thing again for a while. And then, do the same thing the next time you have a little extra funds. You're going to be getting more for the same amount of money. And those are ways that you can basically build up your food storage. Okay, we'll do one more here. One just came in. Leisha said, I heard that Bill Gates is buying up farms. What do you think that is? Okay, so without going into all the different things about Bill Gates, because he's got his fingers in a whole bunch of different things. If you think about it, what do very wealthy people buy to protect their assets, particularly from inflation? They're going to buy things that will maintain their value over time, even when prices are going up, the currency is being depreciated. Land is, as it's often says, they're not making any more of it, right? Land is one of the things that keeps pace with inflation, if not outpaces inflation. I think the simplest answer is that the wealthy buy land and businesses and other things like value as the currency is being depreciated. And so if you are in a position where you have all of your other stuff, all your other ducks in a row, you've got, emergency supplies, you've got food storage built up, you've improved your property so you can grow more food on it, all that stuff. If you've got a bunch of extra funds left over, buying productive farmland is one of the best investments you can make with your money, because of all of these pressures on our food system. And even though you may not be able to produce food on it, like you're not going to go into farming, you might be able to lease it to somebody who is, and in doing that, you are going to be supporting a small producer, and you can probably help secure some of your own food supply going forward. So we can go into a lot more discussion about that topic, but ultimately it comes down to the same issue of the government is basically printing a ton of money out of thin air and injecting it into the money supply, which makes everything more expensive. Inflation's eating away at the value of what you have. So you want to buy things that are essential, like food, now when it's less expensive than later when it's more expensive. And you want to, if you are buying any assets, buy things that are going to keep pace or outpace inflation, so that you are not having the value of your assets being depreciated and eaten away at as much by the inflation that's going to be happening. It's already happening, but it's going to be increasing in its pace for this year. All right. Well, thanks so much, folks, for your attention during the presentation. Just a reminder, our Re-Localizing Your Food Supply sale is on, where we have gardening resources and seeds available at discounts for a limited time. And if you haven't already started planning your garden this year, make sure you go get and use our garden planning calculator, which will help you plan your planting timeline very quickly and save you a lot of time manually calculating your planting dates. So if you have any questions that we didn't get to, please send them by email and we'll follow up with you that way. Thanks again for your time and attention. We appreciate it. Thanks again.